welcome back to some more reveals for the Great Dark Beyond. We've had all of the neutral cards over the course of the weekend, and just, as a final after-dinner mint, we get to see the Priest cards as well. Let's start off with one of the legendary minions. It's Askara. 5 mana 4/5 Draenei legendary minion. Battlecry. The next Draenei you play summons a copy of itself. A pretty powerful effect. Normally this copying of a minion type effect has been seen on 4 mana cards like Soul Split, like on Germination. Obviously Askara works slightly differently to that. You don't immediately upfront get the minion copied. It's on the next play of the card. So it's like playing the spell and then it'd be a bit like Soul Split. Instead of saying, copy a minion on the board, the next minion you play copies. It's a slight difference between the verbiage of the cards, which means that Askara is very slightly slower than these two cards, but it's still good in its own right, because Soul Split and Germination cost 4 mana, Askara costs 5 and you get a 4/5 on top of it. 4/5 stat line is normally something associated with about a 4 mana-ish minion. Would a 4 mana 4/5 see placed in standard? No. At 3 mana maybe, so at the very least this copy of effect is sort of like a 2 mana-ish deal, in my opinion. So as long as you're doing something that's a copy of 3 or more mana, I think you're doing pretty well with Askara. Now I will say, on the side of things of Askara, a lot of the Draenei we've seen so far have been fairly understated with decent battle cries, and especially battle cries that apply the effect onto another turn. So it's like a daisy chain of effects that go down through the course of a game. We've not seen too many big boy Draenei with good aura type effects or a good death rattle. We did see one last time in the Galactic Crusader, 7 mana 3/9 Draenei with Taunt. Death rattle gives you 2 holy spells that get discounted. So that'd be a pretty nice thing to follow up from Askara with. You get 6/18 with Taunt of stats. Is that unfair enough for standard? I'm not entirely certain that it is. One other thing you could do, though, is rather than, copying the Crimson Commander and getting, 2 death rattles on the commander, is the minions in your hand that get buffed by the Crimson Commander. Assuming you get one of these Draenei that gets +2/+2, you play them after the Askara in some sort of tempo deck, and you effectively duplicate the effect of the buffs, right? So you're getting +4/+4 of stat lines instead of +2/+2. Maybe that will work as some sort of tempo-orientated deck. So I guess the Priest Draenei deck is going to be somewhat tempo-orientated, is my gut feeling on this. But are there any other big Draenei for this to copy? Well, yes, there is. There's Shield of Askara, funnily enough. 6 mana 4/8 Draenei. Taunt, Divine Shield, Lifesteal. That is a lot of stats for the cost. It is, though, the same as Wickerflame Burnbristle when you really think about it. That was a legendary minion of the past in Paladin. That was a 3 mana minion for 6 stats with the exact same keywords on it. Shield of Askara is 12 stats for 6 mana, so it's basically a double up of this. There are some big key differences between these two cards, though. Wickerflame was a legendary, so you could only put 1 in your deck, whereas Shield of Askara, you can put 2 copies of it in your deck because it's a common. Also, there is a tribe of Draenei on it, so it can get hit by tribe effects. Also, the statage isn't, symmetrical. You get a 4/8 of stats. With Taunt minions, you only want more health, so I think the Shield of Askara is actually better than Wickerflame Burnbristle for the most part. Obviously, the intention of this is to use it with Askara, funnily enough, since it's her shield, and it curves so beautifully. You play Askara on 5, then on 6 you play 8/16, Taunt, Divine Shield, Lifesteal in stats. The ultimate anti-aggro wall if I've ever seen one. Sounds good, right? It does sound good, but my slight concern with this is that in Shamanland, Shining Sentinel exists, and this is a class that can copy the battle cries or duplicate the battle cries. They can also, deck buff their cards, and Shining Sentinel doesn't see any play, which kind of implies around this, 7 mana-ish region, there isn't really a draw for big, taunty minions. Now, I will say, Shield of Askara comes up 1 turn sooner, and also is statted way better than the Shining Sentinel, so maybe this is good enough. Maybe this is backbreaking enough for a lot of decks that they just simply can't deal with this wall, and you can just beat down your opponent with shields instead. Give them a good old shield bashing. But rather than using the shields, why don't you use the... whatever this healer has got, the magic hands. Overzealous Healer. 1 mana 3/3 Draenei. Death Rattle. Restore 6 health to the enemy hero. Spellburst, silence this minion. The Mad Lads have done it. They have power crept Zombie Chow, the classic zoo card, in my opinion. So many zoo decks would put Zombie Chow in the deck on turn 1, because really all that mattered was that you had board advantage. You always wanted to keep building more and more minions on the board, and just keep pushing through more and more damage each turn. You didn't want your board to be traded out, because if you got into the late game, you would cry, because your deck was not designed to exist beyond turns 8, for example. So the downside of the Zombie Chow wasn't actually too big of a downside for those decks. As long as the Zombie Chow output more than like 5 damage worth of damage, or it required your opponent more mana cost of spells to remove it, you sort of profited in the tempo exchange. Overzealous Healer, you get 1 more attack with it. It's more aggressive than Zombie Chow was. Now, as a trade on this, you do heal for 1 more if it dies. However, there are ways to silence this Overzealous Healer, so you don't have to pay the toll, so to speak. Now, I will say on this, and I actually got caught out by this a little bit, I was thinking of some of the good cards you could spellburst this with, and Silvermoon Brochure, like, on paper looks good, right? You could give this minion immune, you could give it +2/+2. However, spellburst, when I look at the keyword of this, is an after spell cast trigger. So I think the way this orientation would work, and you can tell me if I'm wrong on this one, but I'm pretty certain the Overzealous Healer would get +2/+2 immune and then silence itself so you would lose the statage. It's still not a terrible exchange, but it's still pretty bad. So you might actually want for the Silvermoon Brochure to flip into the shadow side of it, in which case you can give an opponent's minion -2/-2 and silence it, and then trigger your own spellburst. So you have to be somewhat careful with the spellburst not to silence the effect of the spell. Similarly, if you put power code Synchronize on this, I'm pretty certain you would lose the +1/2/2 stat line. That being said, you would get another Overzealous Healer in your hand, and it would be a 1 mana 3/3. It's still pretty good. It's a little bit, awkward though. It's a little bit anti-synergistic now. Also worth noting, you could put this into some sort of Hunter Priest deck with Chilling Vol'jin, and the Hunter side of things has got some 1-cost support in the form of Trusty Fishing Rod, in Pet Parrot. You could also use Bird Watching to do the spell burst, where you're getting more stats into a minion that you'd want probably to follow up on turn 3 with, and you'd silence the healer without getting like a downside to buffing it in some way or statting it in some way. Yeah, I can see a world where that is a thing. And also bearing in mind that of all of this package together, Thirsty Drifter and Pip the Potent both exist, which are rewarding you for playing 1-cost cards. So maybe this Zoo 1-cost Priest Hunter deck might be a thing. I did try to play something fairly similar to this archetype in the past with like a bit of the pain package, and sometimes you could just overwhelm your opponent and smoke them. Sometimes though, and I think this is going to be the issue of this Zooey Priest deck, sometimes you would just run out of stuff, and then you would lose. Priest doesn't really have great hand draw right now. It's kind of the classic thing for Priest is they don't have great draw. Especially right now, they just don't have a good draw engine, so I'm not entirely convinced this will work, but if it does work, Overzealous Healer is probably going to be one of the cards that pushes this very aggressive deck. To be fair as well, I do see a world where you just put this in your Draenei Priest deck, and you just ignore the spell burst to some degree. If your opponent kills it and restores 6 health, who cares? It was still probably going to cost them more than the 1 mana to kill it, so you sort of exchange pretty nicely on the tempo regardless. One other nice way to potentially trigger the spell burst is with Divine Star. 2 mana Holy Spell. Deal 3 damage to a minion, give a random minion in your hand +3 health. In terms of evaluating this card, Holy Smite exists in the game. It's also a Priest card, and that is 1 mana, deal 3 damage to a minion. Doesn't see any play really in Hearthstone right now. So you could kind of argue the Divine Star side of things is 1 mana of it is associated with the Holy Smite effect. The other 1 mana is gaining 3 stats, which is kind of like a bog standard deal. When you bundle it together, you get like a slight discount on this and make the card slightly better. All in all, though, I think this card is a little bit too fair for my liking. Especially if you're going to try and run this in like some sort of tempo-y zoo deck. You don't really want to be gaining health, you'd rather be gaining some attack so you could put more pressure on your opponent. It's a really weird idea that Priest has got this like zooey deck with higher health minions than attack, but it seems to be the direction that Priest is going in. One of the other nice things you can do with this card is Not giving the health to Askara ideally, but if you give health to another Draenei in your hand and you play it after you've played Askara, you get a copy of the +3 health effect of the card, which sort of doubles the value of the Divine Star to some degree at the very least. I still think that's a little bit too fair, to be honest with you. You can also put it into like your Overheal Priest deck and give your Overheal minions a bit more health, so they're more likely to survive, so you can maybe get multiple turns of doing their Overheal triggers. But again, I think that list is so tight right now that you'd struggle to put Divine Star in it, so I just don't see Divine Star seeing any play. One card that might see some play in the Overheal deck is Anchorite, 3 mana 2/4 Draenei. Whenever another minion is overhealed, give it that much extra health. On paper, this card is kind of nuts, right? Clearly, it's going to go in an Overheal deck, so let's just put Overheal cards on the board. 6 of these cards see play right now in Overheal Priest. Overheal Priest has sat around being a tier 1 deck for most of this expansion. As I said, 6 of these cards are seeing play. The one that's not seeing play right now is Heartthrob, but I'll tell you why I've put him on here for a reason in a moment. The dream, obviously, is if you could get Anchorite on the board with like your Hidden Gem, you could get it on there with your Hauler, and then you start doing the combo where you funnel cake your Cleric to draw you cards, to overheal your minions, to do 2 damage to your opponent's minions. If you could then on top of that make your Hauler stronger as well, and make it even stickier so that you could potentially do this combo on another turn, that'd be fantastic. That would be really, really strong. The problem is fitting in this 3 mana expenditure to get Anchorite onto the board, which is an understated minion, by the way, have it live and then start doing this overhealing combo. And to be just completely honest with you, I don't see it. I just can't see how you could afford to take that time off to do this. One of the nice things about Overheal Priest is actually you can do this combo fairly quickly. I actually haven't played the deck too much, but I think it's not unreasonable to get it off on turns like 4 and 5, or at 4 and 5 mana crystals. With Anchorite, I feel like you'd be having to wait till like turn 6, because you really want to get the combo off with Injured Hauler on the ball, have a Hidden Gem on the ball, the Fan Club on the board, the Funnel Cake, the Draw Engine. Any part of this puzzle that you're missing, it severely weakens like the ceiling of what this deck can do. So I just don't see how you can wait that extra turn without getting killed by someone else. I think it'll just make your deck too slow. Where maybe it does see some play, though, is maybe you just don't do this Injured Hauler Hadanis deck. Perhaps use Heartthrob instead. Rather than doing 2 damage to every minion on your opponent's side of the board, you just generate more and more guys with the Heartthrob. So what I'm kind of thinking of is like you play your Fan Club, maybe you coin out Anchorite, maybe then you can get to the Heartthrob turn, assuming Anchorite lives on 2. You push your Fan Club, and you turn your Heartthrob into a 8 health minion, you turn your Anchorite into an 8 health minion, and then you generate another guy. And let's say you can, I don't know how you're going to do this, but let's say you get a Funnel Cake or something in this combo, or maybe you wait 1 more turn longer to give you some mana crystals back to let you do more healing. You could very well get to a situation, and I think fairly early on, like turn 4 and 5, where you could get a fairly full board of minions with fairly low attack, probably, but very high health and hard to remove. And maybe that is good enough for just a back-breaking situation for your opponent not to be able to deal with it. I'm not sure, though, that deck would beat the Injured Hauler variant, so I'm a bit hand-wavy on Anchorite. I'm not convinced right now that it will see play. Speaking of cards I don't think will see play, Lightspeed. 2 mana Holy Spell. Give a minion +1/+2 and rush. Repeatable this turn. Okay, well, this is Sound the Bells. Basically, it's just Sound the Bells, but you get Rush as well. Sound the Bells was a card from The Witchwood, I think it was, and didn't see any play, except in dungeon runs, funnily enough, because of a weird interaction of Echo with mana discounts, that if you mana discounted your Sound the Bells to 0, your Echo copies would all cost 0 as well. And there were fairly easy ways to mana discount in dungeon runs. So if you got to Sound the Bells in your Paladin dungeon run deck and you discounted it to 0, you would win the game, because you could just turn your minion into whatever stat line you wanted to, because there is no turn timer for the most part in dungeon runs, with like some odd exceptions in certain specific games, right? Sound the Bells didn't see any play in Paladin, which is normally a more minion-based deck than Priest. Do I think Lightspeed will see play? No, I just don't see it. I don't understand, again, the logic of this. You could put this onto your Overzealous Healer, but as I said, I think the way the interaction would work is that you would just silence the healer immediately. So you're basically paying 2 mana to cast a spell, which is not a great deal. You could potentially as well use this in some sort of Raza combo with Papercraft Angel to get 5 triggers of your button, but again, there's not really a great pull to do this with the Raza deck, but it is an option, because one of the weaknesses of that Raza deck, and why it just never ever worked, was there weren't enough good ways to generate cheap spells to keep triggering your button. If there were ways to do that, then fantastic. It could actually be a real combo deck, but I don't think Lightspeed is enough to push it. One of the real damning indictments of the card, in fact, is, if you think about it, the Warrior Demon Hunter card with Give a Minion Rush, Finale give them +1/+1, is 0 mana. Which sort of implies that a 0 mana is not super unreasonable to give a minion +1/+1 and rush. Now that is a strong card, I will admit, so I don't think it's crazy strong though. For 1 more health and to get the repeatable tag, would you want to pay 2 more mana? And I just don't simply think it's a good deal. Now I will say, I'm going to assume this card works like Echo, that if you discount the original spell, that the echoed copies of it don't get the mana reduction. I think that's how it works for Holy Maki Roll at the very least, which I don't think says Echo, I think it says repeatable this turn. If that's not the way this card works, then Clearance Promoter would actually possibly see some play in this deck, just to discount the light speeds so that you'd get more triggers of spells cast over the course of a turn. As I said, I'm 99% certain that won't be the way this interacts, but just bear it in mind in case there is some sort of Hearthstone spaghetti code in there. One other thing you have to be somewhat careful with, and I think this is a really, really unrealistic scenario. If you're any class other than Priest, and you put 2 copies of Galactic Crusader in your deck, 2 copies of Watch of the Sun in your deck, and have 2 Concierges, you have 6 chances to hit Lightspeed, because it's a holy spell. I don't know how many holy spells there are in the game. I sort of hand-wavingly guesstimate around 20 to 24-ish. So I think you've got about a 1 in 4 chance of hitting this with the 6 cards of Galactic Crusader and Watch of the Sun. If you do that anytime though, and you're running 2 Concierges in your deck, and you have either a minion on board or a South Sea deckhand, you can just win the game, because you can turn this into a 0 mana repeatable spell that gives stats on the board. So as long as you have charge, you can just send it to the face, assuming no minion with taunt is in the way. I think this is just a complete pipe dream, but just in case you go against a Concierge deck and they play a Watch of the Sun in that deck, that is the Hail Mary they're trying to get. The light speed into double Concierge into 30 attack minion to kill you. In Wild, this is actually way easy to do. You can just do it in Priest with Radiant Elemental. If you put 2 Radiant Elementals on the board and Lightspeed exists, you can turn one of your Radiant Elementals, aka the first Radiant Elemental you put onto the board, you can turn that into a 30 attack minion and just walk over your opponent's face and kill them. I'm going to guess there's going to be a patch before this set comes out, and Radiant Elemental will get the same treatment that the Sorcerer's Apprentice got, and it will say your spells cost 1 less but not less than 1, which would then break this combo and make it not anywhere near as good. I'm actually not convinced if Lightspeed was a 1 mana spell, by the way, if it would see any play in Standard. It can't be a 1 mana spell because of, stuff like Radiant Elemental or other discounters, but I just think this effect is pretty weak on... I just think it's weak in Priest, weak in general. A spell I don't think is weak, though, is Orbital Halo. 2 mana holy spell. Give a minion +2/+1 and Divine Shield. It costs 0 if you played an adjacent card this turn. Crazy. Historically, through Hearthstone, 0-cost spells are really, really good. You normally can break the game in some way with them. Also, classically, spells that cost a certain amount of mana that you can discount to 0 have also been pretty strong. Predation, for example, saw some play in Naga Demon Hunter. It also saw play in Spell Damage Demon Hunter as well, I think. Vendetta saw a little bit play in the Contraband Burglary Rogue decks, but nothing particularly at the highest levels, I will concede. And Safety Goggles sees a bit of play nowadays in Control Warrior and the Highlander Warrior list as well. There just typically is a lot of clamour to get a 0 mana spell. It's so useful for multiple things. You can play other cards with them. For example, any Miracle deck that exists, it's a good card to play in your Miracle deck. In terms of just the card itself, though, if you just want to evaluate this without the discount, it sort of sits somewhere between Sandbreath and Hold the Bridge, 2 Paladin cards. Sandbreath gave you +1/+2 and Divine Shield if you're holding a dragon. That was 1 mana, so you got the stats the wrong way round. But otherwise, fairly similar. Hold the Bridge gave you the stat line in the right orientation, it gave you Divine Shield. Cost 1 more mana, but you also got Lifesteal for that turn, so it sits somewhere between that, which I think, based on the fact that Hold the Bridge and Stand Breath didn't really see any play, I think it's just too fair at 2. But it's very reasonable to discount this card, I think, especially if you're running this in some sort of aggro-ish base deck, which is what I think you're going to be doing. You're probably going to have minions around it, or even spells around it. They're going to cost 1, they're going to cost 2. So you're going to be able to trigger this effect of Orbital Halo fairly easily. You could also use it on your Overzealous Healer, as I've mentioned, to spell burst it, and you could do that on turn 1 as well, if you're really, really desperate to spell burst it. But as I said, I'm pretty certain the way this will interact is it will silence off the 2/1 and Divine Shield, so it might not be worth the deal, to be honest with you. Perhaps you would, in fact, want to do your Overzealous Healer, play another 2-drop, for example, and then put the Orbital Halo on the 2-drop instead, which would still satisfy the spell burst without silencing the effect of the Orbital Halo. That I can see. Another deck you might want to try and put this into is Zarimi Priest, for example. They like to play some pretty cheap dragons in that deck, and if you put on a Whelp Wrangler on the board on turn 2, and you hit the Orbital Halo with the discount, if you turn this Whelp Wrangler into a 4/4 Divine Shield, that is going to be really hard to remove for multiple turns for a lot of decks. So I can see Orbital Halo maybe seeing some consideration in that Zarimi deck. Those are some just really annoying things you do. If you put on a Trapdoor Spider, for example, like, it's going to be horrible to deal with. Like, you're basically going to have to sacrifice a minion at some point to the Speed Ray. And the Speed Ray will live and potentially trade into something else as well. You can also put this on the Adaptive Amalgam. I believe there was a patch fairly recently which just changed how Divine Shield works with the Amalgam. It used to be that when the Divine Shield was popped and the Amalgam died, you didn't get the Divine Shield back. I think now you do get the Divine Shield back when it returns to the board, so maybe you'll do something with an Adaptive Amalgam deck with the Orbital Halo. It gives it both stats and Divine Shield. Or maybe this is the combo that Urzel Rager is desiring. I was memeing about it last time. You play your Urzel Rager on 3, you discount your Orbital Halo to 0, you put the Halo on the Rager, you turn that into a 3-mana 7/2 with Divine Shield. It attacks a random enemy minion, probably will kill it because it has 7 stat lines, and will stay on the board. The minion base combat value off the charts. Oh, and you get the lifesteal as well, you get 7 health. Chef kiss. Absolute cinema. Alright, the intention for all of these holy spells, though, is clearly the other legendary. It's Kure, the Light Beyond, or Kure, the Light Beyond. 3-mana 3/3 legendary minion. Spell burst. Summon a random 3-cost minion. Holy spells don't remove the spell burst. Alright, now we see the package, what the entire deal of this is supposed to be. You're meant to use these holy spells when Kure is on the board. Orbital Halo getting discounted to 0 with Kure is so insanely good because you want 0-mana holy spells. And I think this is the only example of the 0-mana holy spell currently in Standard. You play Halo on your Kure. You get the spell burst effect, you get a 3-drop on top of your Orbital Halo, and you don't break the spell burst on Kure, and you protect it for the future. That is actually a really, really frightening combo. It's part of the reason why I can sort of see this zoo-based priest deck maybe being a real thing. On the side of which says, it won't work, is it's very similar to Railer, where on principle, like, Railer is a lot of good value, but the real limitation is you have to get Railer in your hand, and it's a legendary, it's hard to tutor for it, so maybe the consistency won't be there, but I can see some really disgusting plays with Kure. Also, bearing in mind, there are a lot of cheap holy spells in Priest, and Overheal Priest has a couple of them as well, like Flash Heal, Holy Spring Water gives you 2 copies of it, one is a 2-cost spell, one's a 1-cost spell. Also worth noting for all of this, you can still spell burst this with a non-holy spell. So, for example, I put Funnel Cake on here because it's in the Overheal Priest deck, but isn't a holy spell. Maybe you do like your Flash Heal, you do your Holy Spring Water, you've played your Kure, obviously, you play the other bottle. Let's say you have 1 mana left. Let's be real here, Kure is not going to live through the turn. It is like the primo numero, I have to kill this target, otherwise I'm going to lose the game card. So your opponent is probably going to be willing to use some pretty extreme measures to make sure this dies. So why not just break the spell burst on it? Use the Funnel Cake, give you some more mana, get 1 more trigger of it, especially if your board is full as well, for example. just break the spell burst, get that one additional minion, and maybe use that extra mana to, like, you know, do some more stuff to buff the board state in some way. That's the nice thing about this card. It has got a little bit of flexibility about it. You don't have to go, like, infinitely wide with it. It's actually not even that bad if you just hit the spell burst with a cheap spell once. I obviously think that it's a bit of a waste of value, but I certainly see a world, and I think it's going to be a test of the skill of the player. Because I don't think you're going to run a deck with just holy spells with Kure in it. I might be wrong, but I think you'll probably run some other stuff in it for the cleric draw engine. And it'll be recognizing at what point you're just accepting that you can break the spell burst with, like, a funnel cake, for example, to do some other stuff instead of just getting insane Kure value. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting and powerful card. Also, bearing in mind of all these cheap spells, Pip exists as well, so you could potentially generate a lot more one-cost holy spells. So if you're doing this on, like, turn 10 instead, you could realistically just fill your board with 3 drops. Very strong. Alright, now we get to some cards I don't think are very strong. We have a 0-mana spell, Gravity Lapse. Set every minion's attack and health to the lower of the 2. Alright, I have a qualm here with the Hearthstone team. Please make your cards say the same thing consistently. When something says set every, and it's emboldened in some way, it normally implies it's going to have some extra added twist to the effect. When I first saw this, I thought it was going to be a game-wide effect that any card that was in both players' hands, decks, and board states would take the lowest stat of the 2, which is a very strong effect for 0 mana. But I checked with Hearthstone top decks, and they say that this is going to work only on the board state. So on your board, you're reducing all of your stats and your opponent's stats to the lowest of the 2, which I think is a pretty weak effect, in my opinion. Now, you do have to be careful. I kind of alluded to it before. Hearthstone has got a history of 0-cost spells breaking the game in some way, like Circle of Healing and Lazul's Scheme have seen play in competitive priest decks in the past, neither of which are particularly great cards, especially Lazul's Scheme, for example. But it requires you to have some other miracle aspect to break the game, which is normally why the 0-cost spells are good. And I think currently that just doesn't exist for Priest. One thing I'll say about Gravity Lapse is if you do reduce the board state to an equilibrium on the stat line, it does mean that Gravity Lapse plus Light Bomb is a board clear. Do I think 6 mana Twisting Nether 2-card combo is worth it? No, I don't think it is. So I think Gravity Lapse is going to end up being quite a weak card, having seen, you know, the other priest cards right now. Getting back to 0-mana spells, obviously it's a 0-mana spell for Raza, potentially gives you another trigger on the button, and perhaps this is the way you try and break the game with Gravity Lapse. The other miracle-ish card that exists in the game right now is Pyrotechnician, which I don't think is good enough value for you to really go for the miracle aspect of it. You cast a bunch of 0-cost spells to get random fire spells, and you try and kill your opponent with the random fire spells. I don't see it, so I think currently there is just not a deck out there that wants Gravity Lapse. Also, actually just getting to the effect full stop, clearly it's meant to slow down aggressive decks that are statted with more attack than health. Unfortunately, like, one of the best aggro decks right now is the Pirate one, and the Pirate one isn't really statted in such a way that the minions have more attack than health. It's that they have charge, so the Gravity Lapse won't do anything to those decks, so I don't see it right now with how Hearthstone is, yada yada yada. I don't see it. Maybe it's a good play versus Overheal Priest, funnily enough, because they typically have pretty high health minions. You can bring it down and then clear the board that way, but I don't see the Gravity Lapse really being working. The final card, Mystified To'cha. 4 mana, 4/2. Battle Cry. If the combined health of both heroes is exactly 42, set your hero's health to 42. Alright, I'm gonna give this 5 Doges out of 6 on the meme score. I just don't know how to evaluate this card. This card probably is really bad. I think it's, and I've never seen this before, or read this before, I think it's a nod to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I don't really get the name in relation to it. I did see someone tweet out saying To'cha sounds like torture, and it's kind of what it's probably like to play this card. It's actually, on paper, a good card for a control deck, so to speak. If you could more consistently get the effect to go off and just reset your health to 42, it's really, really strong. It's just going to be this deal of setting both of your combined healths to 42, and I think it's going to be really, really, really hard to do. And if this card was ever remotely strong, your opponent could deal with this by just making it hard to hit 42 by various means, which actually is a pretty good skill check, but this is a meme, right? This is just too much of a meme. I know that Renathal is like getting a renaissance right now, and in part it's because it's giving people 40 health, and this is giving you 42 health, so, you know, it's 2 over 40 times better than Renathal. But Renathal just gives it when you put it in your deck. You don't have to jump through the hoops of Mystified To'cha for the effect. Yeah, I just don't see it. I think the most realistic aspect of this working is you go up against an aggro deck, and you don't do damage to the aggro deck, and you get dropped down to 12 health. That is the most realistic aspect. To be fair as well, in terms of like trying to set it to 42, Priest is probably one of the classes that's best at doing that, because you can both heal your own face and damage your opponent. So they have that going for them, but this is a meme. This won't work. Anyway, that is it for the Priest cards. Priest, I'm not super jumping for joy with. There's some stuff I'm like, okay, I think that's good. There's a few of the cards that are just like, I don't see why these are in Priest. And actually, going into this expansion, Priest was in a pretty rough state. They have like this incredible deck. In fact, they have like 2 really incredible decks, but outside those 2 lists, it's just a barren wasteland for Priest, so I think you're going to be eating fairly poorly again going forwards. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, why not leave a like and subscribe? Everything helps me out. I'll see you next time. Bye!